So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maurya Hanspal, and in this session, we're going to continue our sessions on understanding the fixed income instruments. So what exactly do we mean by fixed income instruments? We need to understand this. As discussed in the previous sessions also, when we talk about the fixed income instruments, as the name suggests, the instruments that give you a fixed income. Fixed income instruments. So fixed income instruments are those instruments that give you a fixed income. But now you would ask me which instruments can give you a fixed income. Because when we talk about the share market or the stock market or the equity market in which the free-floating equity shares are traded, that is bought and sold in the market, at that uh, at that marketplace, there is no fixed kind of return that you are getting. Because return is something that we associate it with stock market, and interest is something that we associate it with bond market. So completely agreed. In terms of stock market or the equity market, the fixed rate of return is not there. But in case of the bond market or the debenture market, as we call them as the fixed income securities or the fixed income instruments market, such kind of return is possible or interest is possible. So before understanding the concept of the fixed income instruments in detail, let's try to understand the two most important terms which people tend to use synonymously with one another. The first term is the return, and the second term is the interest. Always remember, the return is always associated with the terms of stock market. Interest is always associated with the term of fixed income instrument. Yeah. So talking about the fixed income instrument, these are those instruments that give you a fixed rate of interest. These are not the stock market shares or the equity shares. Here we are not talking about the stock market. We are talking about minimum return which I am expecting from that investment. Okay. But that return is not fixed. In reality, either I can get the same 15% of return, or I might get a return higher than that, maybe 15.5% or 16% or 17%, or maybe I might get disappointed while getting a return of lesser than 15%. Maybe 14%, 13%, 12%, or even my portfolio value can turn into negative. So in that case, there is no fixed rate of return or fixed return or fixed income that I am getting. But when I talked about the fixed income instruments, we talk about bonds, we talk about debentures. So both of them can be used interchangeably. Debentures are ideally used in India and bonds are used outside India, but still there is a difference between the two. So the other fixed income instruments apart from bonds or debentures can be your fixed deposits. There can be your, obviously your saving account is also an example of the fixed income instrument. Your treasury bills, your treasury notes, your treasury bonds, T-bills as we call them popularly. Again, people have also a confusion into this fact. They believe that the treasury instruments are one and the same thing. That is, there is no difference between the treasury bills, treasury notes, or treasury bonds. Of course, there is a difference between these three terms. They talk about commercial papers, they talk about certificate of deposits. All these are called the fixed income instrument. Certainly, some instruments that can also help you to accumulate wealth, like for example, the Public Provident Fund, your National Savings Certificate, your National Pension Scheme. Also, for certain goal-oriented schemes also, like for example, some retirement plans, some solution-oriented schemes, some children education plans, some marriage plans, Sukanna Samriddhi Yojana. All these instruments are giving you a fixed rate of return in the form of interest. Though completely agreed, the objective of all these instruments might be completely different. Someone might want to accumulate wealth for the capital preservation and not growth. Someone might want to have the corpus for retirement planning. Someone might be going for some solution oriented plans, maybe for child education or child's marriage or girl daughter education, marriage, or for the purpose of buying a car. Though purpose of buying a car or a house, people tend to go for the equity uh, investments because there you can get more return as compared to fixed income instruments. But certainly the fixed income instruments should also be a part of your portfolio. So firstly, let's try to understand why these fixed income instruments, be it your bonds, your debentures, certificate of deposits, commercial papers, treasury bills, treasury notes, fixed deposits, treasury bonds, should be a part of your portfolio. As stressed about in the previous sessions also, like when I used to talk about the mutual funds, I used to talk about how to create the portfolio. So basically, there are some people who believe in a complete equity portfolio. That is, at least 80 to 85% of their wealth is in equity. There are some people who believe in complete bond portfolio. 80 to 85% or 90% of the wealth or the investment at least is into the fixed income instruments, so bonds, debentures ka portfolio. Whereas some people who combine all these instruments, that is, they have a portfolio of a 50-50 ratio, that is 50% equity or 50% debt, or 60-40 or 40-60, that is the 60% equity or 40% debt, or 40% equity and 60% debt. What is my recommendation? I personally believe a portfolio must comprise of both these instruments, that is equity and debt. Though at least one of your mutual fund or one of your portfolio must have the combination into other funds also. That might be completely equity or completely debt. But one fund at least you must have that should be a combination of both of these. Not always a 50-50% or 1:1 ratio, but a 60-40 or 40-60 will work. Okay. So why I want this ratio, or like why I want a portfolio to be a combination of both the equity instruments and the fixed income instruments. See, particularly starting with an equity portfolio. So just assume you have a portfolio in which at least 90% of your investment is of equity. So equity is very risky and you cannot predict the future returns. You can forecast a return, you can predict the future return, but it might not match your expectations. It is good to match the expectations. It is completely optimism, euphoria, and boom if your expectations turned into reality or your reality crosses your expectations. But it can also be a pessimism for you or a disappointment for you when the return that you get, it falls below your expectations. Okay, so equity market is very risky because a large number of shares are being traded. You have the small cap companies having a market capitalization of less than 5,000 crores, mid cap companies having a market capitalization between 5,000 crores and 20,000 crores. The companies from the 101 rank to the 250 rank. And from above 250, you have the large cap companies. Like you have the mid cap companies, basically, like when we talk about, okay, firstly, like let's talk about the like the market capitalization. Then the last one, above like 20,000 crores, you have the large cap companies. 1 to 100 in the serial order, you have the large cap companies. Not in terms of the market capitalization, but in terms of just the number. Top 100 large cap companies. From 101 to 250, you have the mid cap companies, and starting from 251, you have the small cap companies. Okay, so basically, the large cap companies are less risky because these are the mature companies, and the share price of these companies won't fall much. But when we talk about the mid cap companies and the small cap companies, particularly coming to the small cap companies first after the large cap companies, small cap companies are the most risky companies. And the basic rule of stock market or finance, higher the risk, higher is the expected return. So basically, when these small cap companies are small, and these companies might possess a large amount of risk, because a few of these small cap companies become the mid cap companies in the upcoming future years, and some of those companies also get translated into the large cap companies. So that is why one can say that the small cap companies have a large potential as compared to the large cap companies, because the large cap companies are already matured companies, which people say, and the small cap companies are yet to get matured because they are in their growth stage. Okay, so that is one argument. But I personally believe that the guys who are watching this YouTube live session, do you really think that the Reliance, Tata, HUL, Nestle, which people say are the mature companies and have no growth prospects or new future, is it really true? I personally believe it's not true. Completely agreed. These are the mature companies. These are mature companies only in terms of the market capitalization or the goodwill, or in terms of the profitability, cash flows, and the command they occupy all over the world, or especially in India. In that sense, these are the mature companies. But we cannot call them the mature companies in terms of growth. These companies are still growing because they have realized if they're not investing into expansion, diversification, and various other activities, the new age startups will take over them. Right? Are these companies not doing any kind of investments? Obviously, they are doing. Your Nestle, your Britannia, your HUL, your Reliance, TCS, all these are investing into a large number of facilities. Even Reliance, received so much investments from a large number of players all over the globe to expand its facilities. It started to invest into EV, into hydrocarbon, into clean energy. Tata has completely occupied the EV space. Hero, like the Hero Motor Corp for two-wheeler space. Sonacom, वो तो मतलब कि small company हो गई. But all these companies are still investing because in order to survive, they have to invest. So if anyone says you anytime that these are the mature companies, till that point they are right. But if anyone says you these companies are not investing into more production, into more manufacturing facilities, are not growing, that is wrong. They might grow at a slower pace. They might grow. They also might grow at a higher pace. But they might grow at a slower pace, but so the peak reaches. And to cross that peak, to cross that benchmark, it tends to be very difficult. They have more investment expenditures, they have more the capex theme. The government is also supporting the capex theme nowadays. Right? They have the IT technology themes are coming up, new software companies are coming up, hydroelectricity theme is the EV theme is there, battery as a service, drone as a service, gaming. All these things have come into place. And even the big companies have started to diversify, started to collaborate with other fintechs or various other startup companies also, which have just got listed. Even like recently, the PVR, it also came into collaboration with your Nodwin Games. Okay, so like that was one thing that it came into collaboration that people could really play games on their PVR screen. Like yesterday in the news, RBI had tied up with a new company, a fintech company, to take advantages of the cloud services and all. Even the Reserve Bank of India, the topmost authority of the country, is taking support from the other people because they know in order to survive they have to. Because ultimately people have been depending on like cryptocurrencies which are not the legal tender also. So that is again a separate discussion to talk about. But like coming back to the topic, this was about the small cap companies and the large cap companies. Both have a potential to grow. But agree the small cap companies can have a larger potential to grow as compared to large cap companies because the small cap companies are yet to become mature. And somewhere in between having a market capitalization of between 5,000 crores to 20,000 crores, we have the mid cap companies. Now, 10% of the mid cap companies over the past 10 to 15 years have become large cap companies. But 60 to 70% of the mid cap companies have also fallen down to the small cap companies. So they follow a risk. The large cap companies might have a lesser amount of risk, but the small cap companies have a higher amount of risk. And the largest small cap company you have is the SRF Chemicals. Okay, that was included in the Nifty Next 50. Okay, like when we talk about the SRF Chemicals. Yeah. So that is one thing you need to understand and take into consideration as well. Okay, so coming back to this, so that can be a drawback of an equity portfolio, having the equity shares only and बहुत वहाँ पे फिर risk हो सकता है. Okay, so this was the first portfolio that we talked about, the equity shares portfolio. Now the second one you can have as a bond portfolio. So when we talk about the bond portfolio, it consists just of bonds. But debt securities, your debentures, and all those your certificate of deposits, your commercial papers, your treasury bills, your treasury notes, all these things are included there. Though we'll try to understand these terms separately also, but you need to understand these are the fixed income instruments and they promise to give you a fixed rate of return in the form of interest. Okay. So if anyone is having a completely bond portfolio, so what can be the drawback for that? It might happen that the rate of interest on bond is too low sometimes because at the time of the accommodative easing or at the time of the dovish stand, which the RBI is maintaining right now, or maybe in the terms of the commodity, not commodity, accommodating easing and the easing support or the monetary support, which the RBI provided in consultation with the central bank, with the people of India and the various central banks of different countries at the time of COVID. Like when the rate of interest came down to be too low, though various economies have started to increase the rate of interest, but as on like 5th of March 2022, the rate of interest on India have not been increased. Okay, so that is one thing, and the RBI is focusing more on growth and employment and not on inflation. And that is what we call as the dovish stand, where the RBI is focusing towards growth and employment and not on inflation because RBI thinks inflation can be controlled. But the second scenario is something which is the hawkish stand, which the federal bank is maintaining, or the bank in USA is maintaining because the inflation has crossed all-time high. More than 7% inflation was just reported. In reality, the inflation might be 12-13%, but that is one thing. So they have been focusing more towards inflation and less on growth and employment. Because the growth is there, even the jobless claims have also reduced. That is why their focus is towards more on tackling inflation. But in India, still the unemployment rate is high. Okay, so basically, if the yields are too low in these scenarios, in that case, a bond portfolio, in terms of market to market gains, market to market, because ultimately, like what happens in a case of a bond or a debenture, there is an inverse relationship. There is an inverse relationship between the price of the bond and the yield that you are getting. Yield is nothing but the final return that you get from the bond. There is an inverse relationship between the price of the bond and the yield of the bond. When the price rises, the yield falls. When the price falls, the yield rises. Like for example, you purchase a bond for 100 rupees having a yield of 6%. If the price goes to 120, the yield can come down to 5% or like remain at 6% only. It won't increase. And that is the inverse relationship between the two. And if it comes back to 80 rupees, the yield can increase to like 7% or 8%. So that is an inverse relationship between the two. When the price of bond rises, the yield falls. When the price of bond falls, the yield rises. That is an inverse relationship between the two. So at the time when the yields are too low, the prices of the bond might be too high. Because in terms of equity also, when we say the capital appreciation, we see the market price of equity. 100 ka share hai, we obviously want it to become 200, 500 or 1000. Same price or the face values in terms of bond also. 100 ka bond hai, we want the price to rise at 200, 300. So that ultimately the value of the bond portfolio can rise in terms of market to market gains. Right? But if the price is rising, the yields are falling. And the yields are falling and people are getting less yields and buying a pricey bond. Why would people invest in bonds? They would withdraw their money from bonds and invest into equity. That is the scenario or the drawback that happens in bonds. Ultimately, अगर bonds के price गिर रहे हैं, if the bonds price are falling from 100, 80, 70, 60, so in terms of market to market, it's a loss again and not a profit. But in terms of the interest rate, it's a loss because interest rates का मतलब कि बढ़ते जा रहे हैं, ठीक है? Interest rates के point of view से अच्छा है. फर्स्ट सिनारियो में हमने क्या पढ़ा, अगर बॉन्ड प्राइसेस बढ़ रहे हैं तो इंटरेस्ट रेट कम होता जा रहा है. अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट कम होता जा रहा है, बॉन्ड प्राइसेस बढ़ रहे हैं, दैट वी कॉल इट एज ए री इन्वेस्टमेंट रिस्क. We call it as a reinvestment risk because the interest or the proceeds that you are getting, you cannot reinvest those proceeds or cannot reinvest the interest that you are getting at a higher rate of interest because तुमको फिर कम इंटरेस्ट मिलेगा. Even if you sold your bonds and like invest the proceeds into the market, even after you cannot get a higher rate of interest because the bond prices have risen and the yields have fallen. In the other scenario, uh, if the bond price falls and the yield is rising, in terms of market to market, it's a loss because the prices are falling. But in terms of yield, it is good. So this scenario is the price risk that one is facing. Price risk because जो market to market जो bonds की value है, ठीक है, वो तुम्हारी मान लो 100 से 90 पे आ गई, 80 पे आ गई, 70 पे आ गई, 60 पे आ गई. In that case, you are making a market to market loss. Okay, so that needs to be taken into consideration. In that case, you are making a market to market loss. So two kinds of risks we try to understand in the creation of the bond portfolio. We have a price risk and reinvestment risk. What is the reinvestment risk? When the prices of the bonds are rising and the yields are falling because of the inverse relationship between the bond price and yield. The prices are rising and the yields are falling. Okay, in that case, it's a market to market gain in terms of portfolio, but the portfolio would be suffering the reinvestment risk. The proceeds or the interest payment that like you would be getting from the bonds, they won't be invested at a higher interest rate and you will be getting a lower interest rate in that case. Whereas the second thing that we talked about was about the price risk. Because when the price of the bonds falls, maybe from 100 to 90, 80, 70, the yield will rise. In that case, the bonds can be like reinvested at a higher rate, but it's a price risk because ultimately your portfolio would be suffering a market to market loss. Okay. So we try to understand the advantages of both an equity portfolio and a bond portfolio. Like both have their own advantages and disadvantages. Because, and what can be the biggest advantages of equity? The biggest advantage can be it can give you a very high return as compared to bond also when the market is on a rise. Because bond might give you 8% or 7% interest, and if the equity market does really well, the equity market does really well, it can give you more than that. In that case, the people might regret कि bond में invest क्यों करा. But bond में you have safety. Bonds में you have safety. Check कम return मिल रहा है, but you have safety. And again, following the basic principle of stock market, higher the risk, higher is the expected return. Lower the risk, lower is the expected return. Right? That is one thing. And somewhere in between, you have a portfolio which is a combination of equity and bond. Equity plus bond, the best portfolio. Here it can be like 1:1 और 60-40 रख लो, मतलब 3:2 या 2:3, मतलब जैसा भी ठीक लगे. Okay, equity bond. तो इसमें you get the benefit of both equity and bond. Just in case the market is rising and the bonds are not doing well, the equity will do well. And just in case the yields on bond have risen, because when the yields on bond rises, as the US Fed is planning to increase the yields on bond, the equity market faces a correction. Because people know that the market is getting volatile. Equity market ज़्यादा रिटर्न मिलना हो तो 15-16 का भी दे दे, बट वहाँ पे रिस्क है. बट बॉन्ड्स इंस्टेड ऑफ गिविंग यू 4% 5% रिटर्न जो एकोमोडेटिव ईजिंग के टाइम चल रहा था, नाउ इट्स गिविंग यू 8% 9% रिटर्न एंड सेफ रिटर्न है. एंड इन्फ्लेशन को भी बीट कर सकता है बिकॉज इन्फ्लेशन गोज टू लाइक 6% 7%. तो पीपल स्टार्टेड टू विड्रॉ देयर मनी फ्रॉम द इक्विटी इन्वेस्टमेंट्स, प्लगिंग देयर मनी आउट and putting it into the bond market, right? In that case, the bond market will do well. Okay, so ultimately the effect would be balanced out. It can happen the bond market is not performing well, but the equity market is performing well. It can happen that the bond market is not performing well, but the equity market is performing well. And in the other scenario, like in this scenario, basically the interest yields can be too low in case of bond, and the equity market are giving you a very high return, and the market is on a boom. In that case, the equity market can perform really well, but it does not always perform really well. In the long term it performs, but not always. अब bonds में क्या है? Bonds में maybe the yield rises, and the people think that they can get a safer return on bonds as compared to equity. They start to withdraw their money from equity and put into bonds. In that case, the equity might not do well, and the market might face some correction in terms of equity. So ultimately, the bond portfolio is doing well. So equity and bond are balanced out in that scenario, right? So that thing needs to be understood. That is the one suggest of having. You can have a separate equity portfolio for having more returns, expecting more returns, a bond portfolio for the purpose of safety, and an equity and bond portfolio for both returns. So see, the equity portfolio, we can say that can be in terms of your growth. If you want only growth, if you want only capital appreciation. What is capital appreciation? 100 रुपये इन्वेस्ट कर, you want 200-300 हो जाए उसका. And what type of investor can be here? It can be a risk tolerant investor who likes to take risk in the market, or a risk taking person. Here bond, you can have a risk averse person. A risk averse person is something that does not like to take more risk and wants safety of his investment. एक ऐसा person होगा. And his goal here can be capital preservation, because अगर उसने 100 रुपये इन्वेस्ट करें, he does not want वो 100 से नीचे हो. बिकॉज इक्विटी में अगर 100 रुपये इन्वेस्ट करें तो 200-300 की बात तो अलग है, वो 90-80 भी हो सकता है. So his main goal here can be like capital preservation and income. उसको अगर फिक्स्ड इनकम चाहिए, बिकॉज अल्टीमेटली 8% एंड 7% मतलब पीरियड ऑफ इंटरेस्ट जो भी होगा उसको फिक्स मिलता है. And we can also call it as the non-risk taker person or risk intolerant. So this person in between can be a risk neutral person. Why risk neutral? Because it lies somewhere between the risk tolerant and the risk averse. He can combine both the goals. उसे growth भी चाहिए and capital appreciation चाहिए, साथ में इसको capital preservation भी चाहिए and fixed income भी चाहिए. Like it combines the goals of both of them. And this category is also called your hybrid category. Hybrid category. Investing both into equities and bonds. That we call it as a hybrid category. Investing both into equity and in bonds. A classic hybrid category. So basically, in terms of equity, all the advantages we talked about, and this is only appropriate for a person who is risk tolerant, a risk taking person who can take the risk in the stock market because stock market is volatile. In the long run, the person can get a return on a CAGR basis of like 14%, 13%, and so on. But again, the equity market is something that can give you a higher return as compared to bond market, no matter how much increase in yields happen in the bond market. But bond market offers you safety for the risk averse people and has a combination of both equity and bonds. Okay, that's all for today.